My truck sat in my own driveway. She circled it 3 times with her phone out. By Friday, a tow notice was taped to my window. I stayed calm. Weakness. 6 months passed before she made her real move. Then a badge showed up that wasn't real at all. What she didn't know would end her HOA career for good. My name is Marcus Webb. I spent 11 years on a Metro SWAT team before my knees gave out and I traded raid boots for a desk job training new recruits. These days I run a small nonprofit out of my garage, hauling donated furniture and supplies to veteran families who need a hand getting back on their feet. My wife Renee is an ER nurse, the kind who's seen every version of a bad night and still comes home humming. We bought our house in Maple Ridge Estates 3 years ago because the schools were good and the porch had morning light. We didn't buy it expecting a war. Maple Ridge Estates looked like every glossy real estate brochure come to life. Trimmed hedges. Mailbox flags painted the same approved shade of forest green. Sidewalks power washed twice a year whether they needed it or not. Beneath the tidiness, though, ran a current of rules nobody remembered voting for. Diane Pierce had run the HOA board for 9 years. She wasn't elected so much as installed. The way a fixture gets installed, nobody quite recalls when, but suddenly it's just always been there, humming faintly, judging your grass height. Diane's front lawn had its own laminated maintenance schedule. She trimmed her rose bushes into perfect spheres and referred to the neighborhood as my community, like she owned the deed to every driveway on the street. I first noticed her attention about a month after we moved in. She stood at the edge of our yard with a clipboard, measuring the distance between our mailbox post and the curb like it was a crime scene. Just documenting, she told Renee, flashing a smile that never once touched her eyes. New residents sometimes need a little orientation to our standards. Our standards, she called them, as if the covenant had been handed down from a mountain instead of photocopied off a template by a lawyer 20 years ago. I let it go, picking my battles against real threats, and a clipboard didn't strike me as one of them. I figured politeness would buy peace. I was wrong about that math from the start. The first real friction came over my truck, a faded white F-250 with Web Veteran Outreach stenciled on the door, dented from years of hauling donated couches and bunk beds to families who had nothing. Diane called it an eyesore in a group text before she'd ever said a word to my face. Someone screenshotted it and sent it to Renee out of decency. That was the first crack in the fence. It's a work vehicle, I told her calmly at the next mailbox chat, keeping my voice level the way I'd trained 100 rookies to do under pressure. I use it for outreach to veteran families. I can move it to the side yard if it bothers you. Bylaws are bylaws, she said, tilting her head like I was a child she was being patient with. No commercial vehicles overnight. I don't make the rules, Marcus. I just enforce them. She made plenty of rules. Actually, I'd find that out later, but in that moment I just nodded, filed a permit request with the board, and figured a signature on a form would settle it. It didn't settle anything. Forms. She was interested in being obeyed, and something about my calm made her dig in harder. The way certain people can't stand a fight they can't win by volume alone. Old Tom Higgins, 3 doors down, caught me raking leaves one evening and lowered his voice like he was passing me contraband. "Watch yourself with that one," he said. "She ran off 2 other families before you got here. Always starts polite." The permit I filed sat untouched for 3 weeks. When I followed up, Diane told me the board hadn't gotten to it, though Linda Suarez, the treasurer, later admitted she'd never even seen the request cross her desk. Then came the first violation letter, official HOA letterhead. A $15 fine for an unauthorized commercial vehicle visible from the street after 6 p.m. I'd parked in my own driveway at 4 in the afternoon. I photographed the truck, time-stamped the image, and emailed the board directly. Diane replied within the hour, CCING the entire mailing list, insisting the fine stood regardless of technicalities. Renee wanted to fight it outright. I told her to wait, that people who overreach eventually leave a paper trail. And paper trails were something I understood far better than shouting matches. A second letter arrived a week later. This one claiming my truck's decals violated a signage ordinance that, as far as I could find, existed nowhere in our actual covenant documents. I requested a copy of the covenant section she was citing. Diane sent back a blurry photo of a page that didn't match the numbering of the official document posted on the HOA's own website. That was twist number 1. Though I didn't clock it yet. She was quoting rules that didn't exist, banking on the fact that most people never read the fine print closely enough to catch her. At the next open board meeting, I raised the discrepancy politely, laying both documents side by side on the projector. A few neighbors murmured. Diane's jaw tightened, but she recovered fast, calling it a clerical oversight and moving to adjourn early. Frank Delgado, a retired contractor 2 streets over, caught my eye afterward and gave a small, knowing nod. The kind that says I've seen this movie before and it doesn't end well for her. I kept every letter in a manila folder, every email printed and dated, every photo backed up in triplicate. Old habits. The difference between a case that holds and one that collapses is documentation nobody thought to keep. Renee joked that I was building a case file on our own homeowners association. I told her I was just keeping receipts. Neither of us realized yet how large that file would eventually grow. 2 weeks of quiet followed. I almost let myself believe it was over, that Diane had found some other unlucky family to fixate on. That belief lasted exactly until the Saturday she showed up with a stranger in a polo shirt. He introduced himself as an HOA compliance officer, flashing a laminated badge that looked, on close inspection, suspiciously like it had been printed at a copy shop the night before. We've had reports of ongoing violations, the man said, not quite meeting my eyes. I'm authorized to issue a tow order if the vehicle isn't relocated within 24 hours. I asked for his credentials, his agency, any documentation tying him to an actual municipal or county authority. He stammered, glanced at Diane, and said he'd email the paperwork later. That email never came. Office directly the next morning. They had no record of any compliance officer, contracted or otherwise, operating in Maple Ridge Estates. Twist number 2. There was no HOA police. There never had been. A badge and a title from somewhere and dressed intimidation up as authority, betting nobody would ever check. I didn't confront her yet. Started asking quiet questions around the neighborhood, the same patient way I used to gather intel before ever kicking down a door. Linda Suarez, the treasurer, mentioned over coffee that HOA dues had crept up twice in 2 years for reserve fund maintenance, though nobody could point to a single project the money had funded. Frank Delgado said the same thing about the community pool renovation fund. Money collected, No contractor ever hired. No bids ever posted for board review like the bylaws required. I began to see the shape of something larger than a petty grudge about my truck. Diane's obsession with me wasn't really about a truck at all. It was about control. And control, once threatened, tends to escalate. The next violation notice fined me for unauthorized signage again. This time citing a photo of my truck taken, according to the metadata I checked, from inside Diane's own front yard using a zoom lens. I filed a formal written objection with the board, requesting the matter be tabled until the disputed covenant section could be verified against the county-recorded original document. Diane responded not to me, but to the whole neighborhood email list, painting me as a resident who refuses to respect community standards, carefully omitting any mention of the fabricated bylaw. Neighbors I barely knew started giving me sideways looks at the mailbox. A few stopped waving. Rumor moves faster than fact in a neighborhood like ours, and Diane had a 9-year head start spreading it. Renee took it harder than I did. She'd grown up watching her mother get worn down by exactly this kind of slow, polite cruelty, and she hated seeing the pattern repeat on our own street. "Why don't you just fight back?" she asked one night, frustration cracking her voice. I told her the same thing I told every young operator I ever trained. Don't return fire until you know exactly where the shooter is standing. I started attending every board meeting, taking notes, recording audio with permission, learning who on the board actually believed in Diane and who simply feared crossing her. Tom Higgins pulled me aside after one meeting and finally told me the older story, the one nobody liked repeating. Diane's late husband, Richard, had sat on the board a decade earlier. Richard Pierce had been quietly removed after an audit found nearly $11,000 of HOA funds routed through a landscaping company that, as it turned out, he partially owned. Nothing ever came of it publicly, Tom said. Diane smoothed it over, called it a misunderstanding, and somehow ended up running the board herself within 2 years. People forget. Twist number 3 settled into place like a puzzle piece. This wasn't Diane's first rodeo with HOA money. It was a pattern with a decade-long head start, and I was only just now catching up to it. I began cross-referencing HOA financial disclosures, publicly available through the county's association filings, against the vague line items in our annual newsletter. The gaps were not small. Landscaping invoices for a company registered to an address that turned out to be a UPS mailbox store. Pool maintenance contracts with a firm that no longer existed, according to state business records. I didn't say a word of this out loud yet. Instead, I photographed every document, saved every filing, and kept building the same kind of quiet case I used to build against people who thought nobody was watching. Diane, meanwhile, escalated. A third violation notice arrived, this time a genuine $200 fine, with a threat of lien placement on our home if it went unpaid within 30 days. A lien over a work truck parked legally in our own driveway, based on a bylaw that didn't match the county's recorded document. Renee wanted to call a lawyer immediately. I agreed it was time. A real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and who, within a single phone call, recognized Diane's tactics as textbook. This happens more than people think, Priya told us. Boards without real oversight sometimes turn into personal fiefdoms. The trick is documentation, and it sounds like you've already got plenty. Priya drafted a formal cease and desist regarding the fabricated bylaw citation, along with a records request demanding the HOA produce 3 years of financial statements for independent review. Diane did not respond to Priya directly. Instead, she called an emergency board meeting, framing it publicly as a discussion about a resident's escalating hostility toward community leadership. I sat in the back row of that meeting, calm as still water, while Diane stood at the podium describing me in terms that bore almost no resemblance to anything I had actually done or said. Frank Delgado raised his hand and asked, simply, whether the board could produce the actual bylaw section cited in my violation notices. Diane said she would follow up and moved swiftly to the next agenda item. Linda Suarez caught my eye from the treasurer's seat. Something in her expression told me she'd started doing her own quiet math, and it wasn't adding up in Diane's favor either. After the meeting, Linda approached me in the parking lot, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. "I've been asking for the reserve fund ledger for 2 months," she said quietly. "Diane keeps saying it's with the accountant." "There is no accountant." That was the moment the shape of the whole thing crystallized for me. Not a petty feud over a truck, but a small, tightly held kingdom built on rules nobody could verify and money nobody could trace. I asked Linda if she'd be willing to help gather records if it ever came to a formal challenge. She hesitated only a second before nodding. "I've wanted an excuse for over a year," she admitted. Renee, meanwhile, started noticing something else. Diane's fixation on our truck seemed to intensify precisely whenever the two of us pushed back, as if resistance itself was the trigger rather than the truck. A fourth notice arrived, absurdly citing the truck for excessive dust accumulation, a violation category that, when I checked, simply did not exist anywhere in the covenant. I began to understand that Diane wasn't chasing rule violations at all. She was chasing compliance, obedience, the particular thrill of watching someone fold. I hadn't folded, and that, more than anything, was my real offense. One afternoon I found the fake compliance officer's business card tucked under my windshield wiper. It listed a name, Gary Holt, and a phone number with a disconnected tone when I dialed it. A quick record search, the kind I used to run before every op, turned up something useful. Gary Holt was Diane's brother-in-law, a former private investigator whose license had been suspended 2 years earlier for impersonating law enforcement in an unrelated case. Twist number 4 landed heavy. Diane hadn't hired an outside contractor to intimidate me. She'd recruited family, someone with a documented history of exactly this kind of fraud, betting his old badge would still open doors. I brought this to Priya, who confirmed that impersonating a code enforcement officer, even loosely, could constitute a genuine legal violation depending on how explicitly Gary had claimed municipal authority. We didn't act yet. And precise. Gather everything, verify everything, and only move when the evidence was airtight enough that no clever excuse could wriggle free of it. I kept training new recruits during the week and kept building my folder on weekends. The same discipline applied to 2 very different kinds of threat. One with a rifle and one with a clipboard. Renee started sleeping worse. Not from fear exactly, but from the low, grinding exhaustion of being watched, judged, and misrepresented in a place that was supposed to feel like home. For a stretch of nearly 3 weeks, nothing happened. No letters. No emergency meetings. The quiet felt less like peace and more like the pause before a held breath finally releases. I used the lull to finish cross-referencing every HOA invoice against public business filings. Of 11 vendor contracts over 3 years, 6 led to companies with addresses that didn't check out. Linda quietly forwarded me a partial ledger she'd photographed off Diane's laptop screen during a working session, careful never to touch the device herself, mindful of exactly the kind of evidence that would and wouldn't hold up later. Tom Higgins started showing up to every meeting too, sitting near the back with his arms crossed. A silent reminder to Diane that history had a longer memory than she was counting on. Renee planted tomatoes in the backyard that spring, something she always did when she needed her hands busy while her mind worked through a problem. "This can't last forever," she said one evening. "Something's going to break." I told her she was right, but not the way she meant. I didn't think Diane would simply give up. People who build their identity around control rarely surrender it quietly. They escalate, right up until the moment it costs them everything. A neighbor named Patrice Okafor, 2 houses down, mentioned at a block barbecue that Diane had recently tried the same unauthorized vehicle trick on her son's motorcycle, despite it being registered and legally parked. Patrice hadn't fought it. Friend's garage rather than deal with the harassment. Hearing that made something settle in my chest. This wasn't isolated. It was a pattern, and patterns can be proven. I began quietly collecting statements, not confrontationally, just conversations over fences and driveways, letting neighbors tell their own stories about Diane in their own words, each one another thread in the same fraying rope. Frank Delgado admitted Diane had once fined him for an unauthorized shed that had, in fact, been approved in writing by the board 3 years earlier, approval Diane had conveniently misplaced from the file. The quiet period ended the day the annual HOA audit notice went out, required by state law every 3 years. An audit Diane had somehow managed to postpone twice already under vague procedural excuses. This time, a state association oversight office flagged the delay directly, sending a formal letter to the board requiring financial records be produced within 60 days or face possible penalties. Diane's reaction to that letter, according to Linda, was not panic but a strange, brittle calm. The calm of someone already quietly rehearsing which records to hide and which to conveniently lose. I felt the tide shifting. Slow but unmistakable. The way you feel a storm change direction before the first raindrop ever falls. Diane sensed it too. In my experience, don't retreat. They strike. The second wave of escalation started with a knock at 7 in the morning. 2 uniformed officers stood on my porch. Responding, they said, to a call reporting a stolen commercial vehicle parked at my address. I calmly produced the registration, the title, and photographs proving the truck had been parked in that exact driveway for over a year. The officers apologized, clearly unimpressed with whoever had filed the report. "Ma'am, down the street," one of them said carefully, not naming names, though we both knew exactly who he meant. "Says she's called about this address a few times now." Renee stood in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight in a way I recognized from every time she'd had to hold her composure through a bad shift at the hospital. That evening, Diane posted in the neighborhood app that certain residents were drawing unnecessary police attention to the community, framing the false report as somehow my fault for existing where she could see me. The comment section lit up. A few neighbors defended me outright. Others stayed carefully silent, unwilling to draw Diane's attention onto themselves. Fear, I was learning, was her real currency, not rules. I filed a formal complaint with the police department regarding the false report, along with a copy for Priya's growing case file. A false report, filed maliciously and repeatedly, was itself a chargeable offense. Gary Holt reappeared 4 days later, this time parked across the street in an unmarked sedan, watching our house for the better part of an hour before driving away when I stepped outside. I photographed his license plate and ran it through a contact I still had from my sweat years. He came back registered to Diane's sister, confirming what I already suspected about the family connection. Twist number 5 surfaced here. Gary wasn't just intimidating me on Diane's behalf. He was surveilling me, building his own file, the same tactic I was using against her, except his was built on fear rather than fact. Priya advised getting a home security system with clear exterior footage, both for our safety and for evidence. We installed cameras that week. Quiet insurance against whatever came next. The footage paid off almost immediately. 3 nights later, the cameras caught Gary's sedan idling at the curb at 2 a.m., headlights off, for nearly 20 minutes before pulling away. I sent that clip to Priya and, separately, to the non-emergency police line, establishing a documented pattern of surveillance that no longer looked like coincidence or overzealous rule enforcement. Diane, unaware the cameras existed, kept building her public narrative, telling the board that my aggressive behavior justified continued scrutiny, a claim that grew stranger with each retelling since I had done nothing but document. Linda finally handed me copies of 3 years of HOA bank statements, obtained legitimately through her treasurer access. Statements that revealed transfers to accounts under names none of us recognized. One recurring transfer, $800 monthly, went to an account labeled only Consulting DP. Diane's initials. Consulting for what? Exactly. Nobody on the board had ever approved or even discussed. Frank ran the math out loud at a smaller gathering at Tom's house. Nearly $30,000 over 3 years, quietly siphoned under a vague label nobody had questioned because nobody had thought to look. I felt something settle into place, cold and clear. The same clarity I used to feel walking into a briefing where the pieces of a case finally lined up into a picture you could act on. Renee asked if we should go to the police immediately. Priya counseled patience once more. Embezzlement cases built on partial evidence sometimes collapse under a good lawyer. We needed the full picture, not a fragment, so we kept gathering. Tom dug up old meeting minutes from Richard Pierce's era, drawing a direct, undeniable line between the father-in-law's scheme and the daughter-in-law's current one. Diane, sensing the ground shifting beneath her, though not yet understanding why, doubled down publicly, scheduling a community standards forum, clearly designed to paint me as the neighborhood's real problem. The forum was held in the clubhouse. Folding chairs arranged in rows. Diane at the podium with a PowerPoint slide showing a blown-up photo of my truck beside stock images of dilapidated vehicles for contrast. I sat quietly through the presentation, Renee's hand tight around mine, while Diane described a pattern of noncompliance that existed almost entirely in the gap between her invented rules and reality. When she opened the floor for comment, I stood, thanked her for the opportunity to speak, and calmly asked whether she could point to the specific covenant section cited in my violation notices. She stumbled, again promising to follow up, the same phrase she'd used for months, worn thin now from overuse. A murmur moved through the room, the sound of a story starting to crack under its own weight. Twist number 6 arrived quietly that same night, when Patrice Okafor pulled me aside afterward and admitted she'd recorded the entire meeting on her phone, including Diane's stammering non-answer, and she was willing to share it. Momentum was building, slow but real, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply accumulates, one honest neighbor at a time, until the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. Diane, perhaps sensing this shift, escalated her tactics further. A 5th violation notice arrived threatening not just a lien but eventual foreclosure proceedings if the outstanding fines reached a certain threshold. Foreclosure. Over rules that existed only in Diane's own imagination and a badge borrowed from a man with a suspended investigator's license. Renee read the letter twice, hands shaking with anger rather than fear. I called Priya immediately. She confirmed that HOA foreclosure over disputed fines was legally possible in our state under narrow circumstances, but required documentation Diane simply didn't have, given the fabricated bylaw at the root of it all. She's bluffing, Priya said. But bluffs backed by real paperwork on a board letterhead can still do damage if nobody challenges them. It's time to challenge it formally. In writing, on the record, we filed a formal legal response, demanding the HOA produce the original recorded covenant, all financial statements for the past 3 years, and documentation establishing Gary Holt's authority to issue violation notices. Diane had 30 days to respond under state association law. She used exactly none of that time productively, instead spending it trying to shore up support among board members still loyal to her. Linda told me privately that Diane had asked her directly, almost pleadingly, to just let this one go for the good of the community. Linda had said nothing, which Diane apparently mistook for agreement. I kept training recruits during the week, kept my composure at the mailbox, kept nodding politely whenever Diane passed by with her clipboard, giving away nothing of the case quietly closing in around her. Renee asked how I stayed so calm through all of it. I told her the truth. I wasn't calm because nothing bothered me. I was calm because I'd learned that panic gives away position, and I wasn't ready to give away mine. The 30-day window closed without Diane producing a single requested document. Priya filed a formal complaint with the state's Homeowners Association Oversight Board, attaching Linda's bank statements and Tom's decade-old meeting minutes. Within a week, the Oversight Office responded, opening a formal inquiry into Maple Ridge Estate's financial practices, a process Diane could delay but, for the first time, could no longer simply ignore. Gary Holt vanished from the neighborhood almost entirely after that. No more idling sedans. No more laminated badges. Whether Diane had cut him loose or he'd simply gotten spooked, I never found out for certain. Diane, though, did not retreat. If anything, the inquiry seemed to unlock something more desperate in her. A woman watching a kingdom she'd spent 9 years building begin to show its first real cracks. She started calling board members individually, late at night according to Linda, pressuring them to vote for an emergency bylaw amendment that would retroactively clarify the very rules I'd proven didn't exist. Frank refused to take her calls after the third one. Tom answered once, just to tell her plainly that he remembered exactly what had happened with Richard, and he wasn't about to forget it twice. I began preparing, with Priya's guidance, a formal presentation for the HOA's upcoming annual general meeting, the one gathering where every homeowner, not just the board, would have a vote and a voice. Renee helped me organize the folder into a clean, chronological binder, every fabricated notice, every bank statement, every recorded meeting clip, every witness willing to put their name behind their story. Twist number 7 emerged almost by accident when Linda found an old insurance claim filed under the HOA's master policy, listing storm damage repairs to a roof that, on inspection, turned out to be Diane's own house. The HOA had paid nearly $6,000 toward repairs on Diane's personal residence, disguised in the ledger as common area structural maintenance, a category that, once again, matched nothing in the actual property records. I felt the weight of the folder growing heavier with each new document. Not just proof of harassment now, but a genuine, provable pattern of financial abuse stretching back years under Diane's leadership. Renee started calling it, half joking, half serious, the file that ends her, and honestly, by that point, I wasn't sure she was wrong. The pieces were all there. We just needed the right room to lay them out in. Diane, perhaps sensing the annual meeting would not go her way, tried one last maneuver, a mailer sent to every household, warning of outside agitators, attempting to destabilize community leadership right before the vote. The mailer named no one directly, but everyone on the street knew exactly who it meant. It was, in its own strange way, the clearest confirmation yet of exactly how frightened she'd become. Old Tom laughed out loud when he read it on his porch. 9 years, he said, shaking his head, and she still thinks the trick that worked on scared newcomers is going to work on people who finally know better. With the annual meeting 3 weeks out, Diane's tactics turned sharper, more personal, less concerned with plausible deniability than they'd ever been before. Desperation, I'd learned long ago, makes people sloppy in ways caution never does. She began telling neighbors directly that I had a violent past, vaguely referencing my SWAT background as though a career spent protecting people was somehow evidence of danger rather than discipline. Renee heard about it first from Patrice, who'd overheard Diane at the community mailbox describing me to a newer family as someone who used to break down doors for a living. So be careful. It stung more than the fabricated bylaws ever had. I'd spent a career running toward gunfire so other people wouldn't have to. Hearing it twisted into a threat felt like a wound in a place I hadn't guarded. Renee saw it on my face and, for the first time in months, I saw real fear behind her own eyes. Not of Diane exactly, but of what this slow grinding campaign might eventually cost us. I sat with it for a night, the old discipline kicking back in. Anger wasn't useful. Documentation was. Dated and detailed, directly into the binder Priya was building for the meeting. Twist number 8 surfaced 2 days later when Frank mentioned, almost in passing, that Diane had tried the exact same violent past smear against a black veteran family who'd left the neighborhood 2 years before we arrived. Pattern within the pattern. Diane didn't just target rule violations that didn't exist. She specifically escalated fastest against residents she seemed to view as easiest to intimidate into simply leaving quietly. Frank connected me with that former family, the Ambrose household, now living 2 towns over. Mr. also a veteran, described almost the identical sequence: fake violations, a fabricated compliance officer, and finally a whisper campaign that drove them out. He agreed, without hesitation, to write a signed statement for our binder. "Nobody ever believed us back then," he said quietly over the phone. "Maybe it'll matter more coming from two of us." That call changed something in me. This had stopped being purely personal. It had become something closer to what I'd spent a career doing, standing between someone who abused power and the people that power was crushing. Diane, unaware her old pattern had just been unearthed and connected to a new witness, pressed forward with her campaign, sending Gary Holt back out one final time with a court-looking document that was, in fact, nothing of the sort. It claimed to be a civil notice of trespass violation, language borrowed loosely from actual legal filings but signed by no judge, filed with no court, carrying no real weight whatsoever. I photographed it, cross-referenced the supposed case number with the county court system, and confirmed, unsurprisingly, that no such case existed anywhere in the record. Another fabrication, thinner and more desperate than the last. Priya said this one, unlike the earlier notices, edged closer to outright fraud. Impersonating court process was a far more serious matter than misquoting a homeowner's covenant, and she flagged it accordingly in our filing. Renee wanted to confront Diane directly, face to face, just once. I asked her to wait 3 more weeks. We were close now. Close enough that one wrong move could hand Diane an excuse to reframe the whole story again. Linda, meanwhile, uncovered the deepest thread yet. An $18,000 landscaping contract paid over 18 months to a company registered at the same UPS mailbox address as 3 other suspicious vendors, all traceable, ultimately, back to Gary Holt's home address. Twist number 9 landed like a closing door. Gary wasn't just Diane's enforcer. He was her financial partner, cycling HOA funds through shell vendors, the two of them running a quiet operation disguised as community upkeep. The scale of it stunned even Priya, who'd handled HOA disputes for over a decade. "This isn't mismanagement," she said, laying the documents across her desk. "This is a coordinated scheme. And it's provable." I felt no satisfaction in that moment. Only a grim, settled clarity. The same feeling I used to get staring at a Target package right before a briefing, not triumph. Just the certainty that the work ahead had a clear shape now. Diane's public behavior grew stranger as the meeting approached, oscillating between saccharine friendliness at the mailbox and cold, clipped hostility whenever she thought no one else was watching closely. She cornered Renee alone one afternoon at the community garden, voice low, warning her that standing behind me would only make things harder for our family in the neighborhood going forward. Renee, calm in a way that made me proud, simply told her that our family had done nothing wrong, and that threats dressed up as concern were still just threats, no matter how sweetly they were delivered. That exchange, too, went straight into the binder, a sworn account from Renee added alongside everything else, building a portrait no longer of one disgruntled homeowner but of a pattern impossible to wave away. 2 weeks before the annual meeting, the State Oversight Office sent a preliminary finding letter to the HOA board, citing significant irregularities in financial record-keeping and requesting a full response within 14 days. Diane called an emergency closed-door session to discuss the letter. One Linda and Frank both attended. later describing Diane as alternating between blaming outside interference and insisting everything could still be handled internally. Handled internally, in Diane's language, seemed to mean buried, the same trick that had apparently worked once before with her late husband, when the neighborhood's collective memory was shorter and less organized than it was now. Except this time there was a binder. There was Priya. Statements. Tom's old minutes. Frank's shed approval letter. Patrice's recording. The Ambrose family statement. And Renee's account of a threat delivered over tomato plants. I began to feel, for the first time in months, something like the calm before a well-planned operation. Not the anxious quiet of waiting for trouble, but the steady readiness of knowing exactly where every piece would fall. Diane, perhaps sensing the walls closing in, made her most reckless move yet. 10 days before the meeting, she filed a police report accusing me directly of threatening behavior during a supposed confrontation at the mailbox. The confrontation, according to her report, had happened on a Tuesday afternoon. My security cameras, time-stamped and untouched, showed the mailbox area completely empty that entire day. I hadn't left the house until evening. Twist number 10. The last one, and the most damning. Diane had fabricated a criminal report entirely from nothing, banking on the assumption that my record, my composure, my restraint would somehow make me look guiltier for staying so quiet. Priya submitted the security footage to the responding officers immediately, alongside a formal complaint regarding a pattern of false reporting now stretching back months, this time with clear evidence attached to every claim. The officer who took the new statement recognized my name from the earlier false stolen vehicle report and, without saying much, made it clear this had crossed from a neighborhood dispute into something closer to a criminal pattern. Renee finally let herself cry that night, not from fear anymore but from something closer to release, the exhausting months of careful restraint finally cracking under the sheer, absurd weight of what Diane had tried to pin on me. I held her and told her the truth. We were almost there. Every fabricated notice, every fake officer, every false police report had done nothing but build the very case that would finally end this. Priya finalized the presentation for the annual meeting that weekend, organizing everything into a clean, undeniable timeline, dates, documents, witnesses, financial trails, all of it corroborated, none of it resting on a single unsupported claim. Linda quietly informed the rest of the board that she intended to formally motion for Diane's removal at the meeting, citing breach of fiduciary duty, and asked whether Frank and 2 other members would second it. Frank agreed immediately. The other 2 hesitated, still wary of Diane's reach, until Linda showed them the bank statements privately. After that, hesitation gave way quickly to something closer to quiet outrage. Diane, unaware of exactly how organized the opposition had become, spent her final days before the meeting drafting a speech about unity and protecting community values. Language she'd used for years to paper over exactly this kind of reckoning. Gary Holt resurfaced one last time. Not near our house, but at the county clerk's office, where Priya's investigator noticed him quietly attempting to pull, then abruptly cancel, a records request related to the Shell vendor filings. That attempt, however brief, was itself noted by clerk's office staff and later became one more small thread in the growing rope. Evidence that Gary understood, on some level, exactly how much trouble was closing in. The night before the meeting, I laid out my old service medals on the dresser, not out of pride exactly, but as a quiet reminder to myself of every time discipline had outlasted someone else's rage. This felt no different. Renee ironed a shirt she hadn't worn since our wedding, said nothing about why, and I understood anyway. Some nights don't need explaining. You just show up dressed like the version of yourself that isn't afraid. Tom called that evening just to say he'd be there early to save seats near the front. The same seats. He mentioned Riley. He'd once sat in the night Richard Pierce was quietly asked to step down years before. Frank texted a photo of the shed approval letter, framed and ready to present, along with a single line, "See you tomorrow." Bring the whole binder. Every page of it. Linda sent a message too. Shorter, steadier. The motion is ready. I've got 3 seconds confirmed. It's happening. I read it twice before setting my phone down and finally, for the first time in months, sleeping through the night, the Ambrose family drove 2 towns over that morning. Arriving early, Mr. Ambrose in his old service jacket, standing quietly near the back of the clubhouse like a man who'd waited 2 years for a room willing to listen. Patrice arrived with her phone charged, the recording from the earlier forum ready to play if needed. A small, steady act of courage from a woman who'd once simply moved her son's motorcycle rather than fight. By the time the meeting was set to start, the clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Chairs pulled in from storage. Neighbors standing along the back wall. Word having quietly traveled that something significant was coming. Diane arrived precisely on time. Composed, clipboard in hand, scanning the unusually large crowd with the first flicker of genuine uncertainty I'd seen cross her face in over a year of watching her operate. She opened the meeting the way she always did, thanking everyone for their commitment to our shared community values. Her voice only slightly less steady than usual, though steady enough that most in the room likely didn't notice. I sat in the second row, binder closed on my lap, Renee's hand resting lightly on my arm, Priya seated just behind us with a folder of her own, waiting for the moment the agenda finally opened the floor. The tension in that room felt almost physical. A held breath spread across 60 or 70 neighbors who all, in their own way, sensed that tonight would not follow Diane's usual script of quiet compliance and quick adjournment. Diane moved through routine agenda items with visible impatience, glancing repeatedly toward the door, as if half expecting someone to interrupt before she reached the safety of adjournment. A habit she'd never shown in any prior meeting. Linda, calm and deliberate, waited until the scheduled new business section, then stood, folder in hand, and formally requested the floor to raise a matter of, in her words, urgent fiduciary concern. Diane's smile flickered but held. Of course, Linda. Keep it brief. We have a full agenda. She had no idea yet how thoroughly that agenda was about to be rewritten in front of everyone she'd spent years intimidating. Linda began simply, laying out the discrepancy between publicly filed HOA financial disclosures and the actual bank statements she'd obtained through her legitimate treasurer access. Numbers projected clean and undeniable on the screen behind her. A murmur rolled through the room as the first slide appeared. 3 years of vendor payments beside the corresponding, non-existent business registrations, laid out in plain, unembellished columns nobody could argue with. Diane interrupted, insisting this was not the appropriate forum for financial questions. that such matters belonged in closed board session. Not in front of the general membership she'd always kept carefully uninformed. Frank stood next, holding up the shed approval letter Diane had once claimed didn't exist, reading the board's original signatures aloud, including her own, dated 3 years before her fine had ever been issued. The room's temperature shifted visibly, quiet confusion sharpening into something closer to focused attention. Dozens of people finally connecting small personal grievances they'd each assumed were isolated incidents. Diane's composure cracked slightly at the edges, her hands tightening on the podium, though her voice remained steady as she insisted these were misunderstandings that could be resolved outside of tonight's meeting. Tom stood then, slower than the others, and simply reminded the room, in a voice that carried the weight of 9 years' patience, exactly what had happened to Richard Pierce and exactly how quietly it had been buried at the time. Diane's face went pale in a way makeup couldn't quite hide, the first crack of real fear breaking through the practiced calm she'd maintained through every fabricated notice and every false report she'd ever filed against me. I felt the old, familiar stillness settle over me, the same steady quiet I used to feel right before a breach, every muscle aware, nothing rushed, the certainty that the moment had finally arrived to move. I stood, binder in hand, and asked simply for 2 minutes to share documentation directly relevant to the concerns already raised. Diane hesitated, glanced at the packed room, and, outnumbered, allowed it. I laid it out plainly, without raised voice or theatrics, exactly the way I'd once briefed commanders before an operation: the fabricated bylaw, the false compliance officer, the false police reports, each claim backed by a document projected clearly for the room to see. Patrice played her recording of Diane's stammering non-answer from the earlier Community Standards Forum, her own voice from months ago suddenly filling the clubhouse, undeniable and unedited. Renee read her own account aloud, steady despite the tremor I could feel through her hand still resting on my arm, describing the threat delivered quietly over rows of half-grown tomato plants. Then Mr. introduced himself, and described in careful, measured words the exact same pattern that had driven his family out of Maple Ridge 2 years earlier, long before Diane had ever met me. A woman near the back gasped audibly. Someone else muttered, "The Ambroses," like the name unlocked a memory they'd never fully understood until this exact moment. The pattern, finally, had a face beyond mine. Diane attempted to speak, her voice thinner now, insisting this was coordinated harassment against her, an accusation that landed with almost nobody in a room now holding hard evidence in their own hands. I set the final document on the podium in front of her, the surveillance footage timestamp proving the mailbox was empty on the day of her false report, alongside the county's confirmation that no such court case existed. The room went completely silent. Diane stared at the printed page like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if she looked long enough. It did not. In that room, said everything words couldn't. Linda seized the moment and formally moved for Diane's immediate removal from the board, citing breach of fiduciary duty, financial misconduct, and repeated abuse of authority against multiple residents over multiple years. Frank seconded it before Linda had even finished the sentence. 2 more board members Linda had quietly briefed raised their hands almost simultaneously, the motion carrying enough support before Diane could even attempt a rebuttal. Diane looked out at the room, searching for allies, and found instead rows of neighbors who had each, in their own quiet way, been waiting years for exactly this permission to finally stop staying silent. "You don't understand," she said, voice rising for the first time all night, sharp and brittle. "I built this community. Every rule, every standard, I built it. None of you would even have property values without me." Nobody responded. It wasn't cruel. It was simply final. The sound of a room that had already made up its mind and no longer needed her permission to say so out loud. The vote was called, and the room rose for removal. A landslide so complete that Diane didn't bother requesting an official count. Understanding, at last, exactly how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath her. She gathered her folder with shaking hands. The same clipboard she'd once carried into our yard to measure a mailbox post now trembling against her chest as she walked, unescorted, toward the clubhouse doors. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody needed to. Quiet and unmoved. The same quiet she'd once used as a weapon now turned back on her in the form of collective, unblinking witness. Priya stood and calmly informed the board that, given the scale of the documented financial discrepancies, a referral to the district attorney's office for potential embezzlement charges would be the board's next necessary step. Linda agreed immediately, motioning to formally authorize the referral alongside a full independent audit. A motion that passed with the same overwhelming support as Diane's removal had, just minutes before. I felt no urge to gloat as Diane disappeared through the doors. There was only a quiet, settled exhaustion, the particular tiredness that comes after a long operation finally, cleanly, resolves the way it was supposed to. Renee squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt, tears finally spilling over, not from sadness but from the sheer release of months of careful restraint no longer needing to be carried alone. Tom made his way over slowly, clapped my shoulder, and said only, "Took 9 years and the right man in the right truck to finally end it," before turning to accept a dozen quiet thank yous of his own. Frank shook my hand firmly, then Mr. Ambrose's, the two veterans exchanging a look that needed no words, the particular understanding of men who'd each been underestimated and had each, eventually, proven exactly why that was a mistake. Patrice hugged Renee tightly, apologizing for not speaking up sooner about the motorcycle, about the pattern she'd sensed but never named. Renee told her it didn't matter now. She'd spoken up when it counted most. Linda stayed behind with 2 other board members, already drafting the emergency financial hold on remaining HOA accounts, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been waiting a long time for permission to finally act. Word of the meeting spread through the neighborhood app within hours, this time carrying no ambiguity, no vague warnings about outside agitators, just plain, documented fact finally allowed to speak for itself. The following week, county investigators arrived at Diane's house with a warrant tied directly to the embezzlement referral, executing a search that, according to Tom, drew nearly the entire street out onto their porches to watch. Gary Holt was located separately, his suspended investigator's license now compounding into a fresh charge of impersonating an officer of authority. The shell vendor scheme unraveling thread by thread under formal investigation. Diane was charged within a month with multiple counts of embezzlement, filing false police reports, and fraud related to the shell vendor payments. Charges that, according to Priya, carried real weight given the documentation now backing every claim. She attempted, briefly, to frame herself publicly as a victim of community backlash. But the binder Priya had built left almost no room for that narrative to gain any real traction beyond her own driveway. The Ambrose family, encouraged by how thoroughly the truth had finally surfaced, filed a formal statement with investigators regarding their own experience 2 years earlier, adding weight to the pattern of abuse now firmly on record. I was asked, at one point, whether I wanted to speak to a local reporter covering the story. I declined being seen. It had only ever been about making sure the truth outlasted the lie. Renee felt differently, gently pointing out that other families, quieter than us, less equipped to fight back, might need to hear that standing up to exactly this kind of abuse was possible, and that it worked. We agreed, eventually, to a short statement, careful and factual, focused less on Diane and more on the simple lesson underneath all of it. Documentation, patience, and neighbors willing to finally speak up together. The new interim board, led by Linda, moved quickly to hire an independent auditing firm, revised the actual covenant to match the legally recorded document, and post every future financial statement publicly without exception. My original violation notices, along with every fine Diane had ever issued against me, were formally voided by unanimous board vote. The fabricated bylaw section struck permanently from any future citation. The truck stayed exactly where it had always been, parked in my own driveway, Web Veteran Outreach stenciled proudly on the door. No longer an eyesore to anyone with any real standing left to complain. Renee planted a second row of tomatoes that season, laughing for the first time in months while she did it. The particular lightness of a woman who finally felt like her own yard belonged only to her family again. Mr. Few weeks later, just to say his own former neighborhood was quietly reaching out, curious how exactly the pattern had finally been broken, hopeful they might find a similar path toward accountability. I told him the truth. It wasn't one dramatic confrontation that did it. It was months of quiet documentation, patient neighbors, and simply refusing to fold when folding was clearly what she'd been counting on the whole time. Diane's trial date was set for the following spring, Priya keeping us updated periodically, though by then the neighborhood had largely, gratefully, moved on to simply living without a clipboard measuring their mailboxes. Gary Holt took a plea deal early, cooperating with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony ultimately corroborating nearly every document Linda had painstakingly gathered over those long, careful months. Diane, facing the combined weight of Gary's cooperation and the board's independent audit, eventually accepted a plea as well, avoiding trial but not avoiding the restitution order tied directly to the funds she'd taken. The court ordered her to repay the full amount identified by the audit, along with a suspended sentence contingent on years of probation, community service, and a formal, permanent bar from ever again serving on any homeowners association board. Old Tom read the final court notice aloud on his porch to whoever happened to be walking by, savoring, I think, 9 years of quiet patience finally arriving at exactly the ending it deserved. Diane sold her house within the year, moving away quietly, no farewell gathering, no clipboard-carrying send-off, just a moving truck and a for sale sign that came down faster than any of her old violation notices ever had. The neighborhood, slowly, began to feel different, lighter somehow, mailboxes measured by nothing but their own usefulness. Trucks parked according to actual bylaws instead of whatever fiction had suited one woman's mood that week. Renee and I hosted a small cookout that summer. The first our backyard had seen since we'd moved in. Tom, Frank, Linda, Patrice, and the Ambrose family all crowded onto our patio, laughing louder than the fence line had ever heard. Mr. The glass at one point, simple and unpracticed, just to neighbors who finally believed each other. A toast that landed harder in that yard than any speech Diane had ever given at a podium. I thought, watching everyone gathered there, about every rookie I'd ever trained who thought strength meant volume, meant force, meant being the loudest voice in the room. Real strength, I'd learned again this year, was patience with a plan behind it. Linda mentioned, almost offhand, that the new board was considering renaming the community garden after Tom, in recognition of 9 quiet years spent remembering exactly the history everyone else had been encouraged to forget. I laughed at that. Genuinely, the first easy laugh I'd had about this whole ordeal in what felt like a very long time. The tension of the last year finally, fully, allowed to unclench. Renee caught my eye across the patio and smiled. The particular smile she saved for moments she'd remember later. The kind that says we made it through this one together. Exactly the way we make it through everything. I didn't need anyone in that yard to know I'd once run toward gunfire for a living. That part of my life had already done its job the moment it taught me how to stay steady through a much quieter kind of war. What mattered now was simpler. A truck parked freely in a driveway. A family no longer watched through a stranger's zoom lens. And a neighborhood finally governed by rules that actually existed on paper. The State Oversight Office later cited Maple Ridge Estates as a case study in its updated guidance for HOA financial transparency. Our binder, unnamed but unmistakable, quietly becoming a template for other communities to follow. Priya told us, months afterward, that 2 other HOA boards in neighboring counties had reached out directly, hoping to replicate exactly the documentation process that had finally broken a pattern nobody had managed to stop before. I felt a quiet pride in that, not for myself exactly, but for every family like the Ambroses who'd once been dismissed, now finally given language and evidence powerful enough that dismissal was no longer an option. Renee started keeping a folder of her own now, half joking, labeled simply just in case. A small habit that had outlasted the crisis that first taught us both why documentation mattered more than we'd ever wanted it to. Winter came and went. Annual meeting without incident. Linda presiding calmly. Financial statements projected openly for anyone who cared to check. A formality that no longer felt like a formality at all. Diane's name came up rarely after that, mostly in passing, mostly as shorthand for a season the whole street had survived together rather than as a wound anyone still needed to keep reopening. I still park the truck in the driveway every evening, decals catching the porch light exactly the way they always had, no notice taped to the window, no clipboard measuring the distance to the curb. Some nights I still think about that first laminated badge Gary flashed on our porch. The sheer audacity of it. Betting that a title and a stranger's confidence alone would be enough to move someone who wouldn't move. It almost worked. In the way these things almost always work, not through overwhelming force, but through the quiet hope that the person on the receiving end simply won't bother checking whether any of it was ever real. I did check. In the end, was the entire story. Not a dramatic showdown, just a folder that kept growing until the truth inside it finally outweighed every fabricated page Diane had ever printed. Tom passed by one evening while I was washing the truck, nodded at the fresh coat of wax, and said simply, "Community Gardens got your name on the dedication plaque too, you know, right beside mine." I told him I didn't need a plaque. He just laughed and said that was exactly why he'd nominated me. The same quiet, stubborn refusal to want the credit that had gotten us both through this in the first place. Renee and I still drive past the Ambrose family's new place sometimes, dropping off donations for the outreach program. The truck loaded with furniture instead of controversy now. Exactly the work it was always meant to carry. Mr. It these days. The two of us moving couches the same easy way we might once have moved through a briefing. Comfortable silence between two men who understand each other without needing to explain much. The fake HOA police badge Gary once flashed on our porch sits, of all places, in an evidence locker now. One small laminated lie finally filed exactly where it always belonged, out of anyone's hands but the court's. I keep the original manila folder too, thick now with a year's worth of documents, tucked in a drawer, not as a trophy, just as a reminder of how much patience it takes to outlast someone determined to wear you down. Renee asked once if I regretted not fighting back sooner. Louder, the way some neighbors had quietly wished I would. I told her no. Quiet folders make convictions. I know which one actually changes anything. The new HOA sends out a public financial summary every quarter now. Plain language, real numbers, nothing hidden behind vague line items or borrowed authority. It's a small thing. I think exactly the point. Linda still treats the treasurer position the way I once treated an operation plan. Meticulous, transparent, unwilling to let a single unclear number slide. And the neighborhood is measurably calmer for it. Frank finally got his shed approval framed and hung in his own garage. Not out of spite, just as a quiet marker of the year a forged rule almost cost him something he'd rightfully earned years before. Patrice's son still rides his motorcycle openly now, parked wherever he likes within the actual bylaws. No laminated badge waiting on the windshield. No fear tax quietly collected on people too tired to check the fine print. I think sometimes about how close this all came to simply working. How many families before us had already been worn down exactly the way Diane intended. Quietly, one polite threat at a time, until they simply left. What stopped it, in the end, wasn't force. It was the same discipline I'd carried out of every operation I'd ever run. Stay calm, gather everything, wait for the moment the evidence speaks louder than she ever could. Renee likes to tell people now, half joking at dinner parties, that she married a man who once served on a SWAT team and somehow still says the HOA fight was harder. I laugh every time, because some days it's true. On quiet evenings, I still catch myself checking the porch camera out of habit. Old instincts that never fully switch off. Though these days there's nothing waiting there but the truck, the porch light, and Renee calling me in for dinner. The neighborhood, a year on, feels almost unremarkable again. Exactly the way a good community should feel: quiet, fair, boring in the best possible sense. No clipboard, no zoom lens, no fear disguised as a rulebook. Diane's restitution payments arrive on schedule. According to the court's public record, Priya still occasionally checks. A slow, steady undoing of 9 years spent believing no one would ever add up the numbers. Gary Holt's investigator license is permanently revoked now. One more badge. Real this time. Taken away from someone who'd built an entire second identity out of borrowing authority he was never actually owed. Tom still saves seats at every meeting. Force of habit more than necessity now. Though he says he'll keep doing it anyway. Just in case someone new ever needs a reminder that this community remembers its own history. Mr. family back to visit Maple Ridge last spring. Walking his kids past the community garden. Pointing out, with visible pride, the small plaque that now bears both his name and mine. Renee and I sat on the porch that same evening. The truck parked exactly where it always belonged, and for the first time in a long while, neither of us felt the need to watch the street for headlights. People ask me sometimes what finally beat a woman who'd controlled a neighborhood for 9 years. I tell them the truth. Not anger, not confrontation, just patience, documentation, and neighbors who finally chose to believe each other. The badge was fake. The fear she built her whole reign on was, in the end, the only thing about her that was ever completely real, and it wasn't enough to survive the truth once it finally caught up. My truck still sits in my own driveway every single night, decals catching the porch light, exactly where it always had every right to be. The END.